The moon was a sliver, barely cutting through the thick canopy of pine trees overhead. My buddy Jake and I had set up camp near Clearwater Lake, a remote spot we'd picked specifically because it was so far off the beaten path. Just two guys, a campfire, and a couple of beers. No cell service. No distractions. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful: crickets, the crackle of the fire, the soothing rustle of the wind through the trees. The kind of peace you can only find in the middle of nowhere. But then, there was the second night. It started with the sound. A soft, low humming, like a generator running somewhere in the distance. It was faint at first, barely louder than the breeze. I thought I was imagining it until Jake cocked his head and said, "You hear that?" I nodded, trying to locate the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. We brushed it off, chalking it up to some nearby cabin or a distant airplane. But the sound didn't stop. It didn't grow louder or quieter. It just persisted, like it was burrowing into our skulls. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could feel the hum vibrating through my body, like a second heartbeat. Around 3 a.m., I sat up in my sleeping bag, frustrated. Jake was snoring softly in the other tent, completely unbothered. And then the humming stopped. Silence. Dead, oppressive silence. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring because there's no sound to balance it out. No crickets. No wind. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A single twig snapping somewhere behind our tents. I froze. "Jake!" I called, my voice barely a whisper. No response. The only sound was the blood pounding in my ears. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. A deliberate, sharp snap of a branch underfoot. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. My breath came out in little clouds as I scanned the dark woods. The beam of my flashlight caught nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. Nothing. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the humming returned. Only this time it was louder, and it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but the beam only caught Jake's tent. It looked undisturbed. "Jake, wake up!" I hissed, rushing over and unzipping his tent. But Jake wasn't there. His sleeping bag was empty, crumpled up like he'd bolted out of it in a hurry. Panic set in. "Jake!" I yelled louder this time. My voice echoed through the forest, but there was no reply. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, like it was vibrating through the trees themselves. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. And that's when I saw them. Dozens of them, reflecting the faint moonlight from the edge of the forest. Too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. They didn't blink, didn't move. They just watched. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could barely breathe, let alone move. The humming was so loud now it felt like my skull was splitting open. And then the eyes started moving, slowly at first, gliding between the trees. Their shapes were indistinct, more shadow than substance, but they were massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. I backed away, tripping over a root and falling flat on my back. The flashlight rolled out of my hand, and for a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the sliver of moon above me. When I looked back toward the trees, the eyes were gone. The humming stopped, and Jake was standing there. "Dude," he said, his voice oddly flat. "What's wrong? Where the hell were you?" I demanded, scrambling to my feet. My voice was shaking so badly I barely recognized it. He tilted his head, like he didn't understand the question. "I was right here." "No, you weren't," I shouted. "I checked your tent. You were gone." Jake just stared at me, his face blank. "You're imagining things," he said, but his voice sounded off, too calm, too smooth, like he was reading lines from a script. I didn't believe him. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. That's when I noticed his shoes. They were on the wrong feet. I didn't move, Couldn't really. Jake stood there, barefoot under the glow of the pale moonlight. His breath didn't fog in the cold air like mine did. His stance, his tone, even the way he stood, it was like someone had read about how a person is supposed to behave, but hadn't quite mastered the details. And the shoes. I couldn't stop staring at them. They were muddy, twisted on the wrong feet, like a mannequin dressed in a hurry. "Jake," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you feeling okay?" He tilted his head again, a weirdly robotic movement. "I'm fine, man. I think you're the one freaking out." He forced a laugh, but it sounded mechanical. "Wrong. I think we should pack up and leave," I said, keeping my distance. "Something's not right out here." Jake smiled, or at least he tried to. His mouth stretched too wide. His teeth bared in a way that didn't match the rest of his face. "Leave? Why would we leave? We just got here." Something behind him caught my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees. Too fast to track, too big to be anything normal. It was gone before I could fully process what I'd seen. "I'm serious, Jake. We need to go. Right now." He didn't respond, just stared at me, that frozen smile still plastered across his face. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I noticed his hands. They were hanging at his sides, stiff and unnatural, like he didn't know what to do with them. His fingernails were filthy, caked with dirt, and his skin looked wrong. Too pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, like wax. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice lower now, quieter. "Neither are you." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Jake, what's going on? What's wrong with you?" His head snapped to the side, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings. His smile vanished. "You're asking the wrong questions." That did it. I turned and bolted toward the car, feet pounding against the forest floor, lungs burning as I pushed through the underbrush. Branches snagged at my jacket, my face, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I could hear him behind me, though, his footsteps crashing through the woods, faster than they should have been. Too fast. Jake was chasing me. I don't know how far I ran before I saw the glow of the fire up ahead, marking the campsite. Relief flooded through me. Our car was parked just beyond the tents. If I could make it to the car, I could. The humming started again. It hit me like a physical force, rattling my bones, making my ears pop. I stumbled, clutching my head as the sound overwhelmed me. It was everywhere, vibrating through the ground, the trees, my skull. My vision blurred, the edges of the world smearing into darkness. "Why are you running?" His voice cut through the hum, impossibly close. I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, perfectly still. Too still. "You're not Jake," I said, my voice barely a whisper. His mouth twitched, not into a smile this time, but something else. Something worse. "Maybe not," he said, "but Jake's not here anymore." I stumbled backward, heart racing, desperate to put any distance between me and the thing wearing Jake's face. My back hit a tree, rough bark digging into my jacket. The humming grew louder, pounding in my ears, making my teeth chatter. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside me, vibrating through my chest, my skull, making it hard to think. Jake, or whatever this thing was, took a step forward. His body moved unnaturally, like his joints didn't quite bend the way they were supposed to. His head cocked to the side again, eyes locking onto mine. Those weren't Jake's eyes anymore. They were glassy, hollow, like something wearing a human mask. "Stop," I croaked. Raising a hand like that would do anything. "Don't come any closer." He didn't stop. He kept walking, slow and deliberate, until he was close enough that I could see the faint sheen of sweat, or was it something else? On his skin. His smell hit me, something metallic and damp, like wet earth and rust. "You don't have to fight," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You'll understand soon. It's better this way." I snapped. Panic took over, and I lunged for the nearest thing I could grab. A thick branch lying on the ground. I swung it at him with everything I had, the wood whistling through the air. It connected with his shoulder, hard enough to send a shock up my arms. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head back and let out a low, guttural laugh. The sound was wrong, guttural and wet, like it was being pushed out of his throat by something that didn't belong there. I dropped the branch and ran. The campsite blurred past me as I sprinted toward the car, the tents and the firelight fading into the darkness. The humming chased me, louder now, almost deafening. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me back, like invisible hands clawing at my shoulders. When I reached the car, I fumbled for the keys in my jacket pocket, my fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I jammed the key into the door and flung it open, throwing myself inside and slamming the lock down. But before I could start the engine, I saw something in the rearview mirror. Jake, or what was left of him, was standing at the edge of the trees watching me. His body was illuminated by the faint glow of the fire, but his face was wrong. The skin around his mouth had stretched too far, splitting at the edges to reveal rows of jagged, blackened teeth. His eyes were no longer glassy but pitch black, like twin voids. He smiled, if you could call it that, and raised one hand, his fingers bending in unnatural directions as he beckoned me back. And then, from the trees behind him, more figures emerged. They moved in the same strange, stilted way, their faces twisted into horrifying imitations of humanity. There were at least 5 of them, their eyes all locked onto me. I turned the key in the ignition, the car sputtering to life as I slammed it into reverse. The headlights illuminated the figures for just a moment, long enough for me to see the empty, cavernous holes where their mouths should have been. And then they started running. I floored it. The car shot backward, tires skidding on the dirt as I whipped it around and sped down the narrow path leading back to the main road. The figures followed, their movements impossibly fast, their hollow mouths emitting a sound that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a roar. It was something else, something I couldn't describe if I tried. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the car, through my chest, through my soul. The rearview mirror showed them gaining on me, their distorted limbs reaching out like they could grab the car and rip it apart. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I looked in the mirror again, and they were gone. The road behind me was empty, the forest still. I didn't stop driving until I hit the nearest gas station, the sun rising in the distance. I wish I could say I left that nightmare behind me, that it was just some bizarre, isolated incident. But things didn't end at Clearwater Lake. Not even close. For weeks after I got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started subtly, just that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was standing too close. I told myself it was paranoia, trauma maybe, but then I started noticing things. First, it was the humming. At night, when the city quieted down, I'd hear it faintly, somewhere in the distance. A low, rhythmic vibration so soft it was almost imperceptible. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. It wasn't constant, though. Sometimes it would vanish for days and I'd think I was in the clear. And then, just when I started to relax, it would return, louder. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open. I never leave it open, not in this neighborhood. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing was missing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in the room was heavy, like it had been filled with something unseen. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt beneath the window. They were bare, human, but too big. The toes were long, almost claw-like, and the prints were deep, as if whatever had made them was unnaturally heavy. I moved the very next day, but moving didn't help. Whatever this was, it followed me. 2 weeks after I settled into my new apartment, I woke up in the middle of the night. My room was pitch dark, but I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, every nerve in my body on edge. That's when I heard it. A faint shuffle, like bare feet dragging across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept toward the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. Slowly, I cracked it open and peered into the hallway. It was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. But then I saw it at the end of the hallway just beyond the edge of the light. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too wrong. It didn't move. It just stood there watching me. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice shaking. The shadow tilted its head, just like Jake had. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the bat. For hours, I sat there, back against the door, heart racing. I didn't hear anything else that night, but I didn't sleep either. Things escalated after that. Objects in my apartment started moving. I'd come home to find chairs flipped over, cabinets open, lights flickering. The humming grew louder, more persistent, sometimes rattling the windows and making the walls vibrate. And the shadows, they were everywhere now, always just at the edge of my vision, disappearing the moment I turned to look. I started avoiding mirrors. Every time I caught my reflection, I'd see something off. My movements didn't always match, or my reflection would linger for just a split second longer than it should have. Once, I swear I saw something else in the mirror, standing behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty. The worst was the dream, or at least I hope it was a dream. I was back at Clearwater Lake, standing at the edge of the water. The surface was perfectly still, like glass, reflecting the stars above. But when I looked closer, I saw faces in the water. Dozens of them, twisted, hollow, wrong. They stared up at me, their mouths open in silent screams. And then I saw Jake. His face floated to the surface, his eyes black voids, his mouth stretched into that impossible grin. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice echoing like it was coming from deep underwater. "You could have stayed. You could have joined us." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. But the worst part? When I looked at my reflection in the window, my eyes were black. It's been months now, and I'm still running. From the humming, from the shadows, from whatever I brought back from that cursed lake. But the truth is, I don't think there's anywhere I can go where they won't find me. If you're reading this, let my story be a warning. There are places in this world that don't belong to us. Places where the rules are different. Places where they are watching. And if you ever hear that humming, run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once they see you, they never let you go. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I wouldn't have believed it myself a year ago. But when you've lived it, when you've seen them, you stop caring whether people think you're crazy. All that matters is staying one step ahead. I'm writing this from a motel room in the middle of nowhere. I don't even remember the name of the town. Doesn't matter. I don't plan to stay long. Staying in one place too long is dangerous. They always catch up. A few days ago, something new happened. Something worse. I was driving down an empty stretch of highway late at night, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and the last place I'd stayed. The road was surrounded by dense forest on both sides, the kind that makes you feel like the trees are leaning in, watching. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional road sign. And then, out of nowhere, the humming started again. At first, I thought it was the engine, maybe something wrong with the car. But no, it wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from outside. I gripped the wheel tighter, my stomach sinking. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and the air inside the car felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes again, those figures chasing me. But the road behind me was empty. The humming grew louder still, until it was vibrating through the entire car, making the steering wheel tremble in my hands. My headlights flickered, then dimmed, and the dashboard lights started to fade. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just fog rolling across the road. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't fog. It was a cloud. Thick, dark, and pulsing faintly with an eerie, bluish light. It hung low over the road, completely blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just feet away from the thing. The humming was deafening now, shaking the car like an earthquake. My ears popped, and I clenched my teeth against the pressure. The cloud began to move. It drifted toward me, slow and deliberate, curling and shifting like something alive. My headlights barely penetrated its surface, and as it got closer, the light seemed to bend around it, sucked into its depths. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My hands were frozen on the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, through the swirling darkness, I saw shapes, faces. They pressed against the surface of the cloud, distorted and shifting, their mouths open in silent screams. Jake's face was among them. "You can't run forever," he said. His voice didn't come from the cloud. It came from inside my head. "It's time to come home." My body felt heavy, like something was pulling me forward. My hands trembled as I fought to keep them on the wheel, to keep myself grounded. The car engine sputtered, then died, and the world was plunged into darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the thing in front of me. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Time felt meaningless in that moment, like I was suspended between reality and something else. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cloud began to recede. It pulled back, drifting into the trees on the side of the road, its bluish light fading into the darkness. The humming stopped. I sat there in the silence, gasping for air, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The car lights flickered back on, the engine sputtering to life as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to find out if it was gone for good. I floored it, speeding down the highway, not caring where I was going as long as it was away. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the humming hasn't returned. No shadows, no figures watching me from the trees. For the first time in months, I almost feel safe. But I know better. This isn't over. It's never over. They're waiting, watching, biding their time. And when they come back, I don't think I'll be able to run anymore. So if you're reading this, remember my warning. The humming, the shadows, the faces in the dark. If you ever see them, if you ever hear that sound, do what I didn't. Don't stop. Don't look. Don't let them see you. Because once they do, they'll follow you forever. And eventually, they'll catch you. The past few days have been quiet, too quiet. That's the part that scares me the most now. It's like the calm before the storm, the kind where the air feels too still, and you know something's coming, but you can't see it yet. I've been living off gas station food and barely sleeping. Every creak of the motel floorboards, every car passing by outside, makes my pulse spike. I keep expecting the humming to start again, but it hasn't. That should be a relief, right? Except I've started noticing something else. It's the people. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd go to the gas station or the diner, and someone would be staring at me a little too long. A cashier, a trucker at the next table. It's not the kind of look you brush off. Their eyes don't move the way they're supposed to. Too still, too focused, like they're waiting for me to slip up. And their faces, there's something off about them. Too smooth, too symmetrical, like wax figures just lifelike enough to fool you at a glance. I tried telling myself it was just paranoia, that I was reading too much into it. But this morning, I saw something that I know wasn't in my head. I stopped at a roadside diner for coffee. It was early, just after dawn, and the place was almost empty. A waitress with a forced smile poured me a cup and wandered off to the back. I sat there, sipping my coffee and staring out the window, trying to convince myself I could keep going, that I could outlast this. That's when I saw him, Jake. He was sitting in a booth at the far end of the diner, facing away from me. But I knew it was him. Same build, same messy brown hair. He was wearing the same jacket he had on the last night at the campsite. The one I'd last seen crumpled on the ground, just before I ran for my life. My stomach dropped. My hands shook so badly I nearly spilled the coffee. Couldn't be him. Jake was gone. Whatever came back that night in the woods, it wasn't him. But there he was, sitting in that booth like nothing had ever happened. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The few other patrons glanced at me, their faces unreadable, their eyes lingering a second too long. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to walk toward the booth. Toward him. "Jake," I said, My voice barely a whisper. He didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge me. "Jake, it's me." I tried again, louder this time. "What the hell is going on? Where have you been?" Slowly, he turned to face me. It was his face. But it wasn't him. His eyes were all wrong. Too dark, like they were filled with oil, reflecting nothing but the dim light of the diner. His mouth twitched, stretching into that awful, unnatural grin I'd seen that night at the campsite. "You should have stayed," he said, his voice low, flat, like it wasn't coming from his mouth at all. "We were waiting for you." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. "What are you talking about? What do you want from me?" Jake, or whatever he was, stood up, his movements stiff, mechanical. The other patrons in the diner turned to watch, their heads moving in unison. "I've seen you," Jake said, his voice echoing in my head now. "And once we've seen you, you're ours." The humming started again. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing second. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but it was useless. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside me, vibrating through every nerve, every bone. The lights in the diner flickered, and I felt the air grow heavy, thick, suffocating. The humming swelled, rattling the plates and glasses on the tables. And then I saw them. The patrons stood up, one by one, their faces eerily blank. Their movements were synchronized, like puppets on invisible strings. They all turned toward me, their dark eyes gleaming, their mouths stretching into two wide grins. Jake stepped closer, his head tilting unnaturally to the side. "You can't run anymore," he said, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. "It's time." The windows of the diner shattered all at once, the shards tinkling like falling ice. I bolted, my instincts taking over. I ran through the broken door and into the parking lot, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But the humming followed me. It was everywhere now, in the air, in the ground, in my own chest. I threw myself into the car and started the engine, slamming my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. I don't know how far I drove. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the sun to rise high in the sky, the shadows shrinking. But the humming never stopped. It's quieter now, but it's still there, in the background, like a constant reminder that they're not done with me. They'll never be done with me. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if I'll ever outrun them, or if I'm just delaying the inevitable. But I have to try, because whatever they are, whatever they want, I won't let them take me. Not yet. Not without a fight. You think running will keep you ahead, but deep down, you know it won't. I knew it too, and yet I kept driving. The farther I got from that diner, from Jake, or what was wearing Jake's skin, the more I thought I could breathe again. But the humming never truly left. It was dusk when I finally stopped. My car sputtered into the parking lot of an old rest area, one of those long-forgotten places on a back road that no one uses anymore. The building was faded, its paint peeling, the windows covered with years of grime. A single streetlight flickered above me, casting weak, intermittent light over the cracked asphalt. I needed to rest. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. The world felt like it was tilting, my exhaustion mixing with the constant, faint vibration of the hum that I couldn't escape. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the windshield. The rest area looked deserted. No cars, no people, just the wind stirring the overgrown grass along the edges of the lot. But the humming, it was louder now. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and rot, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard something move. A faint shuffle, like leaves scraping against the ground. The restrooms were ahead, the door hanging slightly ajar. The sensible part of me screamed not to go in, but I couldn't bring myself to sit in the car any longer. I needed to move, needed to feel like I was doing something, anything to keep myself sane. The inside of the building was worse than I expected. The air was damp and stale, and the faint outline of graffiti covered the walls. The overhead lights flickered weakly, buzzing in time with the low hum that seemed to follow me everywhere now. As I stood there, staring into the dimly lit space, I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence. And then the lights went out. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around me. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but my fingers were clumsy, shaking. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so close it might as well have been right in my ear. "Why are you running?" My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a voice. It was his voice. Jake's voice. "Stop this," I stammered, my flashlight finally flickering on. The weak beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked tiles of the floor and the rusted sinks. "You're not real. You're not. You can't run forever." The voice whispered again, echoing off the walls. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam darting over the walls, the door, the floor. But there was no one there, just shadows. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. A figure, tall and spindly, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, those awful, black, hollow eyes, caught the light for just a second before it disappeared into the shadows. I bolted. I don't even remember running back to the car. 1 second I was inside that building, and the next I was slamming the car door shut, locking it and fumbling to start the engine. My chest heaved, every breath feeling like a struggle. But when the headlights flickered on, they illuminated something that made my heart stop. They were standing at the edge of the lot. Dozens of them. Shadows, figures, people, but not people. Their bodies were too thin, their movements too stiff, their faces too wrong. They just stood there, staring at me with those empty, black eyes. Jake was among them. His face was the only one I recognized, and it was twisted into that awful grin. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Come with us," he said, his voice carrying through the air like it was being piped directly into my head. "It's easier if you don't fight." I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car rocketed forward. The figures didn't move, didn't even flinch as I sped past them. But in the rearview mirror, I saw them turn, their heads snapping toward me in unison. And then they started to follow. I don't know how long I drove, the humming growing louder with every mile. It was inside the car now, vibrating through the steering wheel, the seat, my bones. My hands felt numb, my vision blurred, and I could barely keep my foot on the pedal. The road stretched on endlessly, the forest on either side a black void. My headlights flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I screamed, slamming on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It slowed to a crawl, and then it died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the road. The humming stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was only silence. And then, from the darkness ahead, I saw them. Dozens of figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the night. They didn't run this time. They walked, slowly, deliberately, their movements synchronized like some horrible dance. And leading them was Jake. "It's time," he said, his grin widening, his voice echoing in my head. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to think, as they closed in. I wish I could tell you what happened next. I wish I could say I escaped, that I found some way to fight back. But I don't know. I woke up hours later, alone in the car, the engine purring softly as if nothing had happened. But something did happen. I don't know how I know, but I can feel it. Something is different now. Inside me, the humming is gone, but in its place, there's something worse. A silence so deep it feels like the world has stopped breathing. And when I look at myself in the mirror, I swear my reflection is starting to linger, watching me, waiting. If they've left me alive, it's only for one reason. They want me to bring you the warning. So here it is. Once they see you, it's already too late. You think it's over when the humming stops. You tell yourself you're safe because the noise, the shadows, the figures, they're not there anymore. But that's the worst part. The silence. Because when it comes, you realize they don't need to chase you anymore. They're already inside. It's been weeks since that night on the road, but the changes are getting harder to ignore. At first, they were small, subtle, things you could brush off as stress, exhaustion, or paranoia. But now I'm not so sure. It started with the dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my sheets tangled around me, my heart pounding. The details were always blurry, but the feeling was the same. Like I'd been somewhere I shouldn't have. Like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. In one dream, I was back at Clearwater Lake, staring into the water, watching those faces twist and shift beneath the surface. In another, I was in that diner again, surrounded by those people. Those things, with their glassy black eyes and too wide smiles. But the worst dream didn't feel like a dream at all. I was standing in front of a mirror, staring at my own reflection. At first, it was just me, tired, pale, unshaven. But then my reflection tilted its head. Slowly, deliberately, and I didn't. It smiled at me. Its mouth stretched too far, its teeth sharp and dark. And then it leaned closer, its voice a low, guttural whisper that sent ice down my spine. They're watching. I woke up screaming, the sound echoing off the walls of my tiny motel room. My throat was raw, my chest heaving. I stumbled to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and stared into the mirror. It was just me. But for the first time in weeks, I noticed something. My eyes weren't my own. The changes aren't just in the mirror. They're in me, in my thoughts, in my body. I've started losing time. I'll sit down, thinking only minutes have passed, and when I check the clock, hours are gone. Sometimes I wake up in places I don't remember going to. Parking lots, fields, once even the edge of a forest. My hands and clothes are always clean, but my shoes? My shoes are covered in dirt and mud, like I've been walking for miles. And the whispers, God, the whispers, they started out faint, just a murmur at the edge of my hearing. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe the remnants of that damned humming still lodged in my brain. But now they're louder, clearer, and they're calling my name. Yesterday, I decided to test something. I'd noticed the mirror in my motel room, the way my reflection would linger just a second too long, the way it seemed to watch me. I didn't trust it, so I covered it with a towel. But when I woke up this morning, the towel was on the floor. I didn't remember taking it down. My hands were trembling as I stood in front of the uncovered mirror. I stared at my reflection, daring it to move, to blink, to do something I couldn't explain away. For a while, it didn't. It just stared back at me, the same exhausted face I'd seen every day since this nightmare started. But then, just as I was about to turn away, it blinked, and I didn't. I don't know how much time I have left. They're in me now, or at least part of them is. I can feel it growing, spreading, like roots digging into my mind. My thoughts don't always feel like my own anymore. Sometimes I'll catch myself thinking things, dark, violent things, and I don't know where they come from. I tried calling someone for help. My sister, my old roommate, even the police. But every time I pick up the phone, I freeze. My hands won't move. My voice won't work. It's like something is stopping me. Something that isn't me. And the people, they know. The ones at the gas stations, the diners, the motels. They watch me too closely, their eyes lingering just a second too long. Sometimes I swear they're smiling. And sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I see them behind me. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remind me that I'm not alone. That I'll never be alone again. If you're reading this, you still have a chance. You can still avoid them. Don't go to the lake. Don't ignore the humming. Don't stare too long into mirrors. And for God's sake, don't let them see you. Because once they do, it's over. They'll get inside, and you won't even realize it until it's too late. Until you're no longer sure where you end and they begin. I think they're waiting for something. A moment, maybe, or a signal. I don't know. But I can feel it coming. Like a storm building on the horizon. And when it happens, I won't be me anymore. But I'll still be here. Watching. Waiting. Just like they are. I've reached the point where I can't trust anything anymore. Not the world around me, not my own senses, and definitely not myself. The whispers have grown louder, more insistent. They don't just call my name now. They tell me things. They tell me to come back. Last night, I tried to fight it. I barricaded myself in the motel room, pulled all the curtains tight, unplugged every reflective surface, even covered the bathroom mirror with duct tape. I thought if I could block them out, block it out, I might be able to sleep. But sleep doesn't come anymore. Not the way it used to. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Their faces pressed against the inside of my eyelids, mouths gaping, black eyes staring. And Jake, always Jake, standing just behind them, grinning that awful, impossible grin. "You belong to us now," he says over and over, his voice blending with the whispers. And when I wake up, it's like I've forgotten something. Like pieces of myself are slipping away, one by one. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the knock on the door. 3 sharp raps. Precise. Deliberate. I froze, heart pounding. The room was completely dark. I'd made sure of that. But a faint glow seeped in from under the door. Not from the hallway lights. No, this glow was bluish, pulsing, alive. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Just another knock. 3 more, just as precise as the first. I sat there, clutching the knife I'd taken from the motel's kitchenette, staring at the door. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, the knife trembling in my hand. The glow under the door grew brighter. "Come out," a voice said. Not a whisper this time. It was Jake's voice, but it wasn't coming from the other side of the door. It was coming from inside my head. "Leave me alone," I screamed, standing up so quickly the chair I was sitting on toppled over. The room felt like it was vibrating, the air growing thick and oppressive. The door rattled, not from force, but as if something was pressing against it. The bluish glow seeped through the cracks, curling and shifting like smoke. "Come back to us," the voice said, clearer now. "You were never meant to leave." I don't remember much after that. When I came to, the door was open, swinging slowly on its hinges. The barricade I'd made, chairs, a dresser, anything I could stack, was pushed aside, like it had never been there at all. And the whispers, they were gone. At least that's what I thought at first. But as the sun rose, casting its pale light over the desolate road outside the motel, I realized something was different. The whispers weren't gone. They were quiet now, yes, but they weren't outside anymore. They were inside. Every thought, every movement, every fleeting emotion. It all feels like it's being watched, controlled, like I'm a passenger in my own body. Sometimes my hands move without me telling them to. Sometimes my feet carry me to places I don't want to go. This morning, I found myself standing in front of a gas station bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. I don't remember walking there. I don't remember unlocking the door. And when I looked into the mirror, I swear it wasn't me looking back. Tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, and then it smiled. "You're almost ready," it said, its voice perfectly calm, perfectly cold. And then I blinked, and it was just me again. Tired, hollow, terrified. I'm writing this now because I think I'm running out of time. Whatever is happening to me, it's speeding up. I can feel it, like a storm gathering inside my skull, twisting and churning and pulling me under. The gaps in my memory are getting longer. The whispers are turning into commands. And worse, I think I'm starting to like it. When I hear them now, when I see the shadows moving just at the edge of my vision, there's a part of me that feels comforted. Like they're not chasing me anymore. Like they're welcoming me home. I don't know how much longer I can fight this. Every time I resist, it gets harder to pull myself back. Harder to remember who I was before all this started. And the truth is, I'm not sure there's anything left of me to save. So this is my final warning, my final plea to anyone who might stumble across this. Stay away from the lake. Stay away from the woods. Stay away from the humming, the shadows, the whispers. Because once they see you, once they get inside, you're theirs. And if you ever feel that pull, that voice in the back of your mind telling you to look closer, to listen harder, don't. Turn away. Run. Do whatever you have to. Because I didn't. And now, I'm not sure who I'll be when I stop writing this. Or if I'll be me at all. I think this will be my last entry. Not because I want it to be, but because I can feel my grip slipping entirely now. They've taken too much. My thoughts aren't my own anymore. Not fully. My body moves without permission. Sometimes, when I speak, it's not my voice that comes out. And the worst part? I don't even care anymore. This morning, I woke up in a place I didn't recognize. A clearing in the woods. Not the motel, not the car, not anywhere I'd ever been before. The trees loomed high above, their blackened branches clawing at the pale sky like skeletal fingers. The air was cold, damp, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. I didn't remember walking here, but my shoes were caked in mud. My clothes were damp. My hands were filthy. There was something in my pocket, something small and hard, but I didn't dare pull it out. Not yet. The humming was back, louder than ever. It didn't come from any direction, it was everywhere, in the air, the ground, me. It vibrated through my chest, my skull, rattling my teeth. It wasn't trying to drive me mad anymore. It didn't need to. It was a beacon. I wandered through the woods, drawn forward by some invisible force. My legs moved on their own, and I didn't bother fighting it. The part of me that still wanted to survive, to fight, felt small now, weak, distant. Ahead, I saw the lake, Clearwater Lake, the same cursed place where this nightmare began. The water was unnaturally still, like a sheet of glass reflecting the pale, lifeless sky above. The trees around it stood motionless, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And on the shore they waited, dozens of them, shadows in the shape of people, their hollow, black eyes locked on me. Their bodies twitched and shifted, their forms never fully solid, like smoke trying to mimic flesh. Jake was there, standing at the front of the group. His grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting his face like a gash. "You're ready," he said, his voice smooth, calm, final. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, sealing the sound inside. All I could do was stand there, staring at him, as he raised a hand and beckoned me forward. "Come home," he said. I stepped closer. One foot, then another. The air grew colder, the humming louder, until it felt like the world was collapsing around me. The water rippled slightly, though there was no breeze, no movement but my own. When I reached the shore, I felt something in my pocket. That small, hard object I'd been too afraid to examine earlier. My fingers moved almost automatically, pulling it out. It was a shard of glass, a piece of a mirror. I didn't know where it had come from, but as I stared into it, I saw my reflection. And just like in the motel, it wasn't quite me. My face stared back, but my eyes, those dark, hollow voids, weren't mine. And then it smiled. "You're almost there," my reflection said. "One more step." I dropped the shard, watching it vanish into the mud. I wanted to scream, to beg for my life, to fight against whatever this was. But instead, I took another step forward. And another. When I reached the edge of the water, Jake extended his hand. It was pale, bony, impossibly long. I stared at it, trembling, my own hand moving to meet his. "Don't be afraid," he said. "You're one of us now." The water began to ripple, dark shapes moving just beneath the surface. Faces emerged, twisted, hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They stared at me, their black eyes full of longing, hunger, welcome. And then I saw my own face among them. It was over. I don't remember much after that. Just cold water and darkness. When I woke up, I was sitting on the shore, the lake perfectly still again. Jake and the others were gone. The woods were silent. But something was different. I stood up and looked down at my reflection in the water. My eyes were black now, hollow. My mouth twisted into that same impossible grin, stretching too far, splitting my face like a wound. The humming was gone. The whispers were gone. I didn't need them anymore, because I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't afraid. I belonged to them now. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Don't come looking for Clearwater Lake. It's too late for me, but it might not be too late for you. Because once you see them, once they touch you, you'll never escape. And if you hear the humming, run. But don't worry, you won't run for long.